Hello friends, Rob Ewing here with another video. Want to talk about jazz improvisation as usual, but I think what I want to do is just try to build something from the ground up. So in previous videos I've talked about 2-5-1 and stuff like that, but I really just want to start with soloing on one chord and thinking about how the chord is related to the scale, and then from there we can build all kinds of different progressions and stuff. So part of what I want to think about is the connection between what we might call classical harmony and jazz improvisation. Basically, my fundamental idea is that if a song is in a major key or in a minor key, then many, if not all, of the considerations that go into creating melody, either composed or improvised, are the same, whether we're talking about classical music or jazz. And since there's this huge tradition of classical music going back several hundred years, and this whole literature around music theory connected to that, I think we can get a lot from that. So I'm going to start by not thinking in terms of some idea of jazz theory or jazz harmony, but think in terms of what might be the kind of foundations of Western music theory and Western harmony. And looking particularly, I was just working out of this book, which just, there's lots of textbooks like this. This is one I happen to have. I think it's pretty good. It's just an old edition of harmony and voice leading. It's used in a lot of college music programs and that kind of thing. So what I'm going to talk about in this first video is just looking at the major chord, in this case the C major chord, and then its connection to the C major scale, and how we can use that to generate all kinds of different shapes and melodies. And then, so what I'm going to do first is just play a drone that it's actually an Indian tempura drone on C. So they're the drone notes that are being played are C and G. There's actually no third in the drone, but it's actually implied by the overtone series, which is another topic that I won't get into. But so I'm just going to start up the drone and then play a few things. So here we go. So first, just to play the C notes of the tonic triad, C, E, and G. So we call that 1, 3, and 5. And those are the stable tones. Let me turn this down. Those are the stable tones of the triad. And then the other notes in the major scale are unstable. And what they do is they connect stable tones in the triad one way or another. So if we go from one stable, say we go from the root, the 1, to another stable note, the 3, and we connect them with the 2. The 2 is an unstable note, and we call it a passing tone, passing between two stable tones. So there's a passing tone between 1 and 3, passing tone between 3 and 5, and then 2 passing tones between 5 and 8 with the octave. So let's just hear those against the drone. So 1, 2, 3. 3, 4, 5. And then 5, 2 passing tones, 6 and 7 to 8. Do the same thing going back down, 8 to 5. 5 to 3. 3 to 1. So those are all the notes of the major scale, and we can see that it's just they fall into two categories: stable chord tones or unstable / active non-chord tones. 1, 3, and 5 are chord tones. 2, 4, 6, 7 are considered non-chord tones, and they're moving in between stable tones, connecting them in various ways. So those are passing tones. Another way that we can conceive of those notes that aren't the stable tones is the idea of neighbor tones. Neighbor tones is when we start on a chord tone or stable tone, move to an unstable tone, either up or down, and then back to that same stable tone rather than moving on to another stable tone. So an example, let's listen to the sound of upper neighbor tones. These are neighbor tones that are scale degree above the stable tone, and then back to the stable tone like this. So 1, 2, 1. of 1-7-1. So that's upper and lower neighbor tones, and also passing tones. One thing I want to mention is the idea that in particular, the neighbor tones or passing tones that are a half step away from a chord tone have a particular kind of melodic intensity to them. So in major, that would be the distance between, or the relationship between 4 and 3, and then also between 7 and 1. So 4 has this strong kind of gravity that wants to move to 3 because it's a half step above 3, you know, so there's just a tension there that wants to be resolved. Similarly with 7 being a half step away from 1 has a strong sense of pull to 1. So just to demonstrate those. So here's 4 wanting to move to 3. And then 7 wanting to move to 1, or 7 sometimes called the leading tone. Okay, so much more to come on that once we get into dominant chords and all that kind of stuff, but just to notice that. All right, so then a couple other ideas with neighbor tones. One is, these are just giving us more options for creating different ways of generating melodies. One is the idea of the incomplete neighbor. So this is where we go from stable tone to a neighbor tone, but we don't move back to that same stable tone. We go somewhere else with it. And one example that is presented in the book that I mentioned is that we go from stable to neighbor, and then to the neighbor of a different stable tone, and then resolve to the stable tone that's connected to that new neighbor tone. So an example would be 1, 2, 4, 3. So 1 is stable, 2 is a neighbor, 4 is a neighbor, 3 is stable. So like this. There's another one would be 3, 4, 6, 5. Alright, so you can come up with other variations for that. Another idea with neighbor tones would be the idea of a double neighbor, and so this is where you move from a stable tone to a neighbor, either above or below, and then we move to the other neighbor of that same stable tone, and then back to the stable tone. So for instance, we can go from 1 up to 2, that neighbor tone, and then skip over back down below to the lower neighbor tone 7, and then resolve to 1. So like this. Or we can go. Or. Yeah. Okay. So that's double neighbor tones. One other thing I want to talk about in this video is just adding a little bit more chromaticism. So as I was talking about before, that relationship between 4 and 3 and 7 and 1, because it's a half step away from that stable tone, it generates a particular kind of heightened melodic intensity of wanting to resolve in a certain way that's stronger than what we see when we have passing tones or neighbor tones that are a whole step away from the stable tone. So we can add additional chromaticism to generate that in relationship to other chord tones. So for instance, I'm going to go the lower neighbor tone to 3, naturally occurring in that major scale is 2, like this. But I can choose to use the lower neighbor tone that's a half step below 3, which is now going to be a chromatic tone, meaning it's outside of that major scale, just to generate more intensity of wanting to resolve back to that 3. So like this. So compare the two. Okay, so we might look for other places in the scale where that's a possibility. So if I look at 5, scale degree 5, stable tone 5, chord tone 5. Let's go a half step below that one. Right? So that's also a chromatic tone, that F sharp. We could try that above the 5 too. So rather than just going to A, go to A flat. Combine the two. so that's adding a lot of chromaticism that is not from that major scale at all, but it's still totally within the context of that underlying major chord. So that's where we can start to find, that's where things start to reveal themselves, that we can actually use lots of notes beyond just the major scale, but we're still in the context of a major chord, major tonic chord. And we'll look at lots more to do with that later. Future video, the next video, I want to get into minor scales, the minor chord. And so there's other things that come into play with minor. But thanks for watching, and always welcome any comments or questions. Let me know what you think, and I'll be back. Thank you. Bye.